Picture this: Paris, 1943. A woman walks down the Champs-Élysées in broad daylight. German officers nod politely as she passes. She smiles back. Her papers are impeccable, her accent flawless. But here's what they don't know. Her real name isn't Marie Dubois. She isn't French. And hidden in her handbag is intelligence that could change the course of the war. This woman is a ghost, not literally, of course, but in every way that matters. She's one of hundreds of Allied operatives who disappeared into occupied Europe, shedding their true identities like snakeskin, becoming someone, anyone else. These weren't your typical soldiers. They didn't charge beaches or fly bombers. Their battlefield was the human mind itself, and their weapons were far more subtle than bullets. Welcome to the invisible front of World War II. Welcome to Ghost Operations. But here's the question that haunts military historians to this day. How did ordinary people, teachers, housewives, musicians, transform themselves so completely that even trained Gestapo interrogators couldn't break their cover? What psychological techniques did they use? And perhaps most unsettling of all, at what point does the person you're pretending to be become more real than who you actually are? By 1940, the map of Europe had been redrawn in blood. Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg had swept across the continent with terrifying speed. France had fallen, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, all under Axis control. Britain stood alone, battered but unbroken, separated from the occupied territories by a narrow stretch of water that felt like an ocean. But here's what the Germans didn't fully understand. While they controlled the streets, the buildings, the governments, they couldn't control the shadows. And in those shadows, a different kind of war was brewing. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE for short, was established with a directive so audacious it seemed almost impossible. Set Europe ablaze, Churchill commanded. But how do you start fires when the enemy controls every match? The answer lay not in conventional warfare, but in something far more insidious, deception operations so sophisticated, so psychologically penetrating, that they would make the Nazis question their own intelligence, their own people, even their own minds. Think about your daily life for a moment, your habits, your accent, the way you hold a coffee cup, how you react when startled. Now imagine having to consciously suppress every single one of those behaviors, every moment of every day, knowing that one slip, just one, means torture and death. Could you do it? More importantly, would you even know what behaviors you needed to hide? This was the chilling reality facing ghost operation recruits. They weren't just learning to lie, they were learning to become lies incarnate. The occupied territories were a labyrinth of paranoia. German soldiers patrolled every street. Collaborators lurked in every cafe, every market, every church. The Gestapo had perfected the art of the midnight knock, the sudden arrest, the disappearance into the night. In France alone, over 40,000 people would eventually be deported to concentration camps for resistance activities. Freedom wasn't just restricted, it was extinct. Curfews dictated movement, ration cards controlled survival, radio ownership was forbidden, even casual conversations could be deadly. The penalty for listening to BBC broadcasts? Prison, or worse. The consequence of helping a downed Allied airman? Execution, often of your entire family. This was the terrain into which ghost operations would deploy their most valuable assets, human beings willing to utterly erase themselves. But the Germans had advantages too. They controlled the infrastructure, the police, the documentation systems. Every identity card had to be perfect, every backstory had to be bulletproof. One anachronistic detail, a wrong date on a permit, an outdated stamp, a regional accent from the wrong province, could unravel months of preparation in seconds. So, Allied intelligence developed something revolutionary. They stopped trying to fight the system. Instead, they would become the system. They would turn the Germans' own bureaucracy, their own assumptions, their own prejudices against them. Here's where it gets fascinating. The Nazis believed they were racially superior, intellectually invincible. They trusted their systems implicitly. And that arrogance? That would be their fatal flaw. because while they were looking for saboteurs with dynamite, they completely missed the most dangerous weapons of all: a forged stamp, a perfected accent, and nerves of absolute steel. The invisible front wasn't about territory, it was about perception. And the first rule of ghost operations was devastatingly simple. The best disguise isn't one that looks convincing, it's one that makes people stop looking altogether. Let me take you inside the training facilities, the secret country estates in England where ordinary people underwent extraordinary transformations. These weren't spy schools from the movies, no elegant martinis or sophisticated gadgets. This was something far more intense, far more invasive. The process began with destruction. Before you could become someone else, you had to obliterate who you were. Your name? Forgotten. Your hometown? Never mention it. Your family, your education, your favorite foods, the songs you hummed unconsciously. All of it had to be buried so deep that even under torture, you wouldn't accidentally reveal your true identity. But here's the paradox that drove some trainees to breakdown. You can't just erase yourself and leave a blank space. Human beings don't work that way. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the mind. So while you're destroying your real identity, you simultaneously have to construct an entirely new one. Not just memorize it, inhabit it, become it. And that's where the real psychological warfare begins. Not against the enemy, but against yourself. Meet Marie Dubois, except that's not her real name either. Let's call our operative by her actual name, Nancy Wake, an Australian socialite who became one of the Gestapo's most wanted, with a bounty of 5 million francs on her head. But we'll return to her story later. First, let's understand how someone like Nancy learned to become Marie. The identity construction process was meticulous to the point of obsession. You weren't just given a fake name and papers, you received an entire life, complete with a birth certificate, school records, employment history, even fictional childhood memories that you had to internalize so completely that you could recount them while half asleep or under extreme stress. Your backstory had to be geographically consistent. If you claimed to be from Lyon, you needed to know not just the major landmarks, but which baker made the best croissants in 1935, what the local priest looked like, how the factories smelled on humid summer days. The devil, as they say, lived in the details, and the Gestapo loved details. Imagine being asked, "Where did you go to school?" Simple question, right? But now imagine that every detail of your answer is being cross-referenced against Nazi intelligence files compared to the testimony of actual residents from that town who've been arrested, analyzed for consistency with weather patterns, historical events, local dialects. One mistake, just one, and the next question will be asked with pliers and electricity. Then came the documents themselves. This was forgery elevated to fine art. Allied intelligence assembled teams of master craftsmen who could replicate anything: German stamps, French identity cards, travel permits, ration books. They aged paper with tea and tobacco smoke. They studied ink composition under microscopes. They even matched the wear patterns on typewriter keys. But perfect documents were only the beginning. You had to know how a real French citizen would carry those documents, folded in a particular way, worn at specific edges. A pristine identity card was suspicious. Nobody's papers looked new after months of German occupation. Some operatives would deliberately crease their forgeries, expose them to rain, even spill coffee on them to create authentic aging. The physical transformation was equally total. Hair color changed, posture adjusted. Even walking patterns had to be modified. The British walked differently than the French, the urban French differently than rural farmers. Instructors used mirrors, film cameras, and brutal honesty to break down every gesture, every expression, every unconscious tick. Language training went far beyond fluency. You needed to master regional dialects, class-specific vocabulary, even the correct way to swear in a moment of surprise. An operative posing as a Parisian shopkeeper couldn't use the colloquialisms of a Marseille dock worker, and you had to maintain this linguistic precision while exhausted, terrified, or injured. Here's something that kept instructors awake at night: accent drift. Spend enough time speaking another language, adopting another persona, and something terrifying happens. you start to forget your native speech patterns. Some operatives reported nightmares where they couldn't remember their real voices. Others found themselves thinking in their cover language, even when alone. At what point does the mask become the face? Let me share a specific case study that illuminates just how radical these transformations could be. Consider the operative codenamed Madeline. We'll reveal her real name shortly. She arrived at training as a gentle, soft-spoken woman, a musician by training, someone who embodied grace and refinement. Her mission required her to become something entirely different, a hard-edged black market courier, someone comfortable with violence, someone who could talk her way through Gestapo checkpoints while carrying explosives. The psychological distance between who she was and who she needed to become was vast, and that gap had to be bridged in mere months. The training was relentless: weapons handling, silent killing techniques, radio operation under stress, resistance to interrogation, but perhaps most importantly, improvisation. Because no matter how perfect your preparation, something always went wrong. A checkpoint that shouldn't exist, a question you weren't prepared for, a collaborator who claims to know your fictional cousin. And this is where we discover what truly separated the successful operatives from those who didn't make it. Not technical skill, not physical courage, but something more fundamental: the ability to stay in character while everything is falling apart, to maintain your fabricated identity even when your rational mind is screaming at you to run, to break cover, to save yourself. Some operatives built their cover identities on kernels of truth, easier to remember, easier to maintain. If you were actually a teacher before the war, perhaps your cover would be a governess. If you grew up in a coastal town, maybe your fictional childhood happened near the sea as well. These anchors of authenticity could be the difference between a convincing lie and a fatal one. But others chose the opposite approach. They created personas so radically different from their true selves that the psychological separation was complete. No risk of accidentally revealing genuine memories, no emotional connections to cloud judgment. They became actors so committed to their roles that the original person, the real person, was deliberately suppressed, sometimes for years. Which approach worked better? Here's the uncomfortable truth: both succeeded and both failed. Some operatives maintained their cover for years, only to be undone by a single moment of authentic emotion. Others broke under the psychological strain of total self-erasure, making mistakes they never would have made otherwise. The human mind, it turns out, isn't designed for long-term self-deception. We're going to see the consequences of that reality in ways both heroic and tragic. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living every single moment in a state of hypervigilance. Every conversation is a test. Every stranger is a potential threat. Every knock on the door could be your last. You can't relax. You can't drop the act. Not with your resistance contacts, who might be compromised. Not with the people you're supposedly living with, who could be informants. Not even when you're alone, because even your dreams could betray you. Some operatives were trained not to talk in their sleep, to control even their unconscious minds. Training lasted months. The British SOE facilities in Beaulieu, Arisaig, and other secret locations became pressure cookers of psychological transformation. Some recruits broke. They discovered they couldn't maintain a false identity under stress, couldn't kill if necessary, couldn't bear the moral weight of deception. These weren't failures. They were honest about their limitations. It took a special kind of person to succeed at this work, and here's what might surprise you. Often it wasn't the people you'd expect, not the tough, aggressive types, not always the obvious heroes. Sometimes the most successful ghost operations came from the most unlikely candidates, because the key skill wasn't physical strength or even courage in the traditional sense. It was the ability to disappear in plain sight. To be so utterly convincing in your ordinariness that people's eyes would slide right past you. To master what psychologists call social camouflage, not hiding in the shadows but hiding in the light, surrounded by enemies who never thought to question whether the person right in front of them was real. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of ghost operations, something that upended conventional military thinking and revealed uncomfortable truths about warfare, espionage, and the nature of courage itself. The operatives who excelled at this invisible war weren't who the generals expected. They weren't men at all. Now let's talk about what these ghosts actually did once they materialized in occupied territory. Because disguise and deception weren't ends in themselves, they were tools for a far more ambitious goal: psychological warfare so sophisticated it would make the enemy question reality itself. Traditional warfare is tangible. You blow up a bridge, destroy a factory, ambush a convoy. The results are visible, quantifiable. But psychological warfare? That operates in the realm of doubt, paranoia, and confusion. And in occupied Europe, the ghost operations pioneers discovered something remarkable. A single person, properly positioned, could create chaos completely disproportionate to their physical presence. Think about it this way: what's more damaging, destroying one German supply truck, or making the Germans so paranoid about saboteurs that they divert thousands of soldiers to guard supply trucks that will never be attacked? What creates more disruption, killing one collaborator, or spreading rumors that create an atmosphere where collaborators suspect each other, report each other, tear their own networks apart from the inside? This was warfare as psychological virus, and the operatives were patient zero. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1943, British intelligence learned that German morale in France was becoming a problem. Soldiers were exhausted, homesick, increasingly demoralized by reports from the Eastern Front. But how do you exploit that? You can't simply airdrop leaflets. The Germans would just confiscate them. You need something more insidious. The solution? Whisper campaigns. Ghost operatives working with local resistance cells began spreading carefully crafted rumors. Not obvious propaganda that would be dismissed immediately. Instead, they seeded small, believable lies designed to metastasize. Did you hear? The rations are being cut again next week. My cousin works at headquarters. They're planning to extend all deployments by 6 months. The SS arrested 3 officers yesterday for black market dealings. None of it had to be true, it just had to be plausible. And once planted, these rumors would spread organically, gaining details and seeming authenticity with each retelling. Here's the genius of it. The Germans would then waste enormous resources investigating these false reports. They'd interrogate their own soldiers, they'd conduct internal reviews, they'd create new security protocols, all to counter threats that didn't exist. This is psychological warfare at its most elegant, making your enemy defeat themselves. But the whisper campaigns were just the beginning. Ghost operations excelled at what intelligence professionals call perception management, manipulating how the enemy understood reality. And one of their most powerful techniques was the creation of phantom resistance networks, and here's how it worked. A single operative, or a small team, would fabricate evidence of a massive resistance organization that didn't actually exist. They'd stage small acts of sabotage in different locations, each using slightly different methods, suggesting multiple independent cells. They'd leave behind conflicting signatures, communist symbols in one location, Gaullist messages in another, creating the impression of a vast, diverse underground movement. The Germans would then commit substantial military and intelligence resources to hunting these phantom groups. Units that should have been fighting the Allies on actual battlefields were instead conducting raids on empty safe houses, arresting confused civilians, chasing ghosts. One documented operation involved an SOE agent who created an entirely fictional black market network. But perfect documents were only the beginning. You had to know how a real French citizen would carry those documents. Folded in a particular way, worn at specific edges, a pristine identity card was suspicious. Nobody's papers looked new after months of German occupation. Some operatives would deliberately crease their forgeries, expose them to rain, even spill coffee on them to create authentic aging. The physical transformation was equally total. Hair color changed, posture adjusted, even walking patterns had to be modified. The British walked differently than the French, the urban French differently than rural farmers. Instructors used mirrors, film cameras, and brutal honesty to break down every gesture, every expression, every unconscious tic. Language training went far beyond fluency. You needed to master regional dialects, class-specific vocabulary, even the correct way to swear in a moment of surprise. An operative posing as a Parisian shopkeeper couldn't use the colloquialisms of a Marseille dock worker, and you had to maintain this linguistic precision while exhausted, terrified, or injured. Here's something that kept instructors awake at night. Accent drift. Spend enough time speaking another language, adopting another persona, and something terrifying happens. You start to forget your native speech patterns. Some operatives reported nightmares where they couldn't remember their real voices. Others found themselves thinking in their cover language even when alone. At what point does the mask become the face? Let me share a specific case study that illuminates just how radical these transformations could be. Consider the operative codenamed Madeleine. We'll reveal her real name shortly. She arrived at training as a gentle, soft-spoken woman, a musician by training, someone who embodied grace and refinement. Her mission required her to become something entirely different, a hard-edged black market courier, someone comfortable with violence, someone who could talk her way through Gestapo checkpoints while carrying explosives. The psychological distance between who she was and who she needed to become was vast, and that gap had to be bridged in mere months. The training was relentless. Weapons handling, silent killing techniques, radio operation under stress, resistance to interrogation, but perhaps most importantly, improvisation. Because no matter how perfect your preparation, something always went wrong, a checkpoint that shouldn't exist, a question you weren't prepared for, a collaborator who claims to know your fictional cousin. And this is where we discover what truly separated the successful operatives from those who didn't make it. Not technical skill, not physical courage, but something more fundamental. The ability to stay in character while everything is falling apart, to maintain your fabricated identity even when your rational mind is screaming at you to run, to break cover, to save yourself. Some operatives built their cover identities on kernels of truth, easier to remember, easier to maintain. If you were actually a teacher before the war, perhaps your cover would be a governess. If you grew up in a coastal town, maybe your fictional childhood happened near the sea as well. These anchors of authenticity could be the difference between a convincing lie and a fatal one. But others chose the opposite approach. They created personas so radically different from their true selves that the psychological separation was complete. No risk of accidentally revealing genuine memories, no emotional connections to cloud judgment. They became actors so committed to their roles that the original person, the real person, was deliberately suppressed, sometimes for years. Which approach worked better? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Both succeeded and both failed. Some operatives maintained their cover for years, only to be undone by a single moment of authentic emotion. Others broke under the psychological strain of total self-erasure, making mistakes they never would have made otherwise. The human mind, it turns out, isn't designed for long-term self-deception. We're going to see the consequences of that reality in ways both heroic and tragic. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living every single moment in a state of hypervigilance. Every conversation is a test. Every stranger is a potential threat. Every knock on the door could be your last. You can't relax. You can't drop the act. Not with your resistance contacts who might be compromised. Not with the people you're supposedly living with who could be informants. Not even when you're alone, because even your dreams could betray you. Some operatives were trained not to talk in their sleep, to control even their unconscious minds. Training lasted months. The British SOE facilities in Beaulieu, Arisaig, and other secret locations became pressure cookers of psychological transformation. Some recruits broke. They discovered they couldn't maintain a false identity under stress, couldn't kill if necessary, couldn't bear the moral weight of deception. These weren't failures, they were honest about their limitations. It took a special kind of person to succeed at this work. And here's what might surprise you. Often, it wasn't the people you'd expect. Not the tough, aggressive types. Not always the obvious heroes. Sometimes the most successful ghost operations came from the most unlikely candidates, because the key skill wasn't physical strength or even courage in the traditional sense. It was the ability to disappear in plain sight. To be so utterly convincing in your ordinariness that people's eyes would slide right past you. To master what psychologists call social camouflage, not hiding in the shadows but hiding in the light, surrounded by enemies who never thought to question whether the person right in front of them was real. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of ghost operations, something that upended conventional military thinking and revealed uncomfortable truths about warfare, espionage, and the nature of courage itself. The operatives who excelled at this invisible war weren't who the generals expected. They weren't men at all. Now let's talk about what these ghosts actually did once they materialized in occupied territory. Because disguise and deception weren't ends in themselves, they were tools for a far more ambitious goal. Psychological warfare so sophisticated it would make the enemy question reality itself. Traditional warfare is tangible. You blow up a bridge, destroy a factory, ambush a convoy. The results are visible, quantifiable. But psychological warfare? That operates in the realm of doubt, paranoia, and confusion. And in occupied Europe, the ghost operations pioneers discovered something remarkable. A single person, properly positioned, could create chaos completely disproportionate to their physical presence. Think about it this way. What's more damaging, destroying one German supply truck or making the Germans so paranoid about saboteurs that they divert thousands of soldiers to guard supply trucks that will never be attacked? What creates more disruption, killing one collaborator or spreading rumors that create an atmosphere where collaborators suspect each other, report each other, tear their own networks apart from the inside? This was warfare as psychological virus, and the operatives were patient zero. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1943, British intelligence learned that German morale in France was becoming a problem. Soldiers were exhausted, homesick, increasingly demoralized by reports from the Eastern Front. But how do you exploit that? You can't simply airdrop leaflets. The Germans would just confiscate them. You need something more insidious. The solution? Whisper campaigns. Ghost operatives, working with local resistance cells, began spreading carefully crafted rumors. Not obvious propaganda, that would be dismissed immediately. Instead, they seeded small, believable lies designed to metastasize. Did you hear? The rations are being cut again next week. My cousin works at headquarters. They're planning to extend all deployments by 6 months. The SS arrested 3 officers yesterday for black market dealings. None of it had to be true, it just had to be plausible. And once planted, these rumors would spread organically, gaining details and seeming authenticity with each retelling. Here's the genius of it. The Germans would then waste enormous resources investigating these false reports. They'd interrogate their own soldiers, they'd conduct internal reviews, they'd create new security protocols, all to counter threats that didn't exist. This is psychological warfare at its most elegant, making your enemy defeat themselves. But the whisper campaigns were just the beginning. Ghost operations excelled at what intelligence professionals call perception management, manipulating how the enemy understood reality. And one of their most powerful techniques was the creation of phantom resistance networks. Here's how it worked. A single operative, or a small team, would fabricate evidence of a massive resistance organization that didn't actually exist. They'd stage small acts of sabotage in different locations, each using slightly different methods, suggesting multiple independent cells. They'd leave behind conflicting signatures, communist symbols in one location, Gaullist messages in another, creating the impression of a vast, diverse underground movement. The Germans would then commit substantial military and intelligence resources to hunting these phantom groups. Units that should have been fighting the Allies on actual battlefields were instead conducting raids on empty safe houses, arresting confused civilians, chasing ghosts. One documented operation involved an SOE agent who created an entirely fictional black market network. She didn't actually run any black market operations. Instead, she carefully leaked information suggesting that a massive underground economy was funneling resources to the resistance. The Germans launched extensive investigations which only confirmed the existence of the normal black market that exists in any occupied territory. They interpreted routine criminal activity as coordinated resistance, seeing patterns where none existed. This is the power of suggestion, weaponized. Once you make someone believe something exists, they'll find evidence for it everywhere. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Ghost operations turned it into a tactical advantage. But here's where it gets truly Machiavellian. Sometimes the goal wasn't even to deceive the Germans directly. Sometimes the target was the collaborators, the French police, the informants, the local officials working with the occupation, because if you could make the collaborators paranoid, suspicious of each other, the entire occupation infrastructure would begin to corrode from within. Imagine being a French policeman working for the Germans. You've made your choice for whatever reason: ideology, opportunism, coercion. Now imagine hearing rumors that the resistance has infiltrated the police force, that there are double agents everywhere, that the person at the next desk might be passing information to the Allies. Suddenly you're looking at your colleagues differently. Trust evaporates. Communication breaks down. The machinery of collaboration seizes up. This was social engineering on a massive scale, and it required operatives with extraordinary psychological insight, the ability to understand human motivation, to predict how people would react to certain information, to model the cascade effects of carefully planted deceptions. The Allies also exploited German prejudices and assumptions with ruthless efficiency. Nazi ideology was riddled with contradictions and blind spots. They believed in their own racial superiority, which meant they consistently underestimated their opponents. They assumed women were harmless. They thought civilians were passive. They trusted their own documentation systems implicitly. Every one of those assumptions became a vulnerability. Consider the German obsession with bureaucracy and credentials. They created elaborate systems of documentation, believing these systems were unbreakable. But that very complexity became a weakness. The more complicated your system, the more opportunities for exploitation. Ghost operatives didn't just forge documents, they understood the psychology of bureaucracy. A German checkpoint guard sees hundreds of papers every day. He's bored, tired, following routine. What makes him look closer? Nervousness? Irregularities? But what if your papers aren't just good? What if they're perfect? What if you approach the checkpoint with the bored confidence of someone who's been through this 1,000 times? What if you subtly signal through body language and manner that you're someone important, someone connected, someone who shouldn't be questioned too closely? The psychology of authority is powerful. People are trained to defer to confidence, to accept official documents, to not make waves. Ghost operatives mastered this psychology. They didn't just pass through checkpoints, they made guards feel foolish for even considering stopping them. There's a documented case of an SOE operative who was stopped at a checkpoint with forged papers that were actually slightly flawed, a wrong date stamp. But she responded with such imperious anger, such offended dignity, that the German soldier apologized and waved her through. She didn't outsmart the system, she outperformed it. This raises a fascinating question. What's more powerful, perfect deception or confident imperfection? Sometimes the tiny flaw makes the forgery more believable because real documents have flaws. But then you're gambling that the person checking won't notice or will interpret the flaw as authentic wear rather than forgery. These were life and death decisions made in split seconds with no room for error. The invisible army concept was another psychological masterstroke. Military intelligence on both sides was obsessed with order of battle, knowing how many troops the enemy had, where they were positioned. The ghost operations exploited this by creating the impression of far larger forces than actually existed. A classic technique, the same small team would conduct operations across a wide geographic area over a short time period. Each operation would have slightly different characteristics, different targets, different methods, different signatures. German intelligence would analyze these attacks and conclude they were facing multiple separate units. On paper, It might look like the Allies had 20 resistance cells operating in a region, where in reality there were perhaps 3 or 4 actual teams, supplemented by strategic deception. This had profound strategic effects. The Germans couldn't ignore the apparent resistance presence. They had to respond, but they were chasing smoke. Every soldier guarding a rail line that would never be sabotaged was a soldier not fighting at Normandy or Anzio. Every intelligence officer analyzing phantom resistance networks was an officer not focused on actual Allied operations. Let's talk numbers for a moment. Historians estimate that perhaps 13,000 SOE agents were deployed throughout occupied Europe during the war. Not all of them were ghost operations specialists. Some were saboteurs, organizers, radio operators, but even the most generous estimate puts the number of deep cover identity specialists at maybe a few hundred. A few hundred operatives against hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and security personnel, against the combined might of the Wehrmacht, the Gestapo, the SS, and countless collaborators. On paper, it was absurd, laughable, impossible. And yet those few hundred ghosts created a level of paranoia, resource diversion, and operational disruption that diverted significant German resources away from conventional military operations. How? Through the multiplier effect of deception. One person, properly positioned with the right intelligence and the right cover, could influence thousands. This is what modern military theorists call asymmetric warfare. The weak don't defeat the strong through direct confrontation. They do it through misdirection, through exploiting vulnerabilities, through making the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The Nazis controlled Europe through overwhelming military force and bureaucratic control. Ghost operations turned that bureaucracy into a weapon against them, used their own security paranoia to paralyze their response capabilities. But psychological warfare has a reciprocal effect that's often overlooked. While ghost operatives were subverting enemy minds, they were also damaging their own. The constant deception, the perpetual fear, the moral ambiguity of their work, these weren't abstract costs. They were paid in fractured psyches and shattered identities. Here's something the official histories rarely address. What happens to your sense of self when you've successfully convinced everyone, including yourself on some level, that you're someone else? When the performance is so complete that it's no longer clear what's performance and what's genuine. When you've told your cover story so many times that it feels more real than your actual memories. Some operatives reported dissociative experiences, moments where they couldn't remember their real names, where they responded to their cover identities even in safe houses with their handlers, where the boundaries between truth and deception blurred beyond recognition. This wasn't mission success, this was psychological trauma in real time. The invisible war exacted invisible wounds. We celebrate the tactical brilliance, the courage, the impact on the war effort. We talk less about the operatives who never fully recovered their original identities, who lived the rest of their lives with fractured senses of self, who succeeded so completely at becoming someone else that they forgot how to be themselves. And this brings us to a critical question. Who could sustain this kind of psychological burden? Who possessed the mental resilience to live a lie without being consumed by it? Who could operate in this moral twilight, deceiving, manipulating, sometimes condemning innocent people to suspicion or death as collateral damage, and still maintain their humanity? The answer, surprisingly, was often found in a group that conventional military wisdom had completely overlooked. Because while the generals were looking for the toughest, most aggressive soldiers, the ghost operations architects realized something revolutionary. The most effective operatives in occupied Europe weren't men at all. Let's be absolutely clear about something. Women weren't just participants in ghost operations. They were often the most effective operatives in the field, achieving results that their male counterparts couldn't match. And the reason why reveals something profound about the nature of perception, prejudice, and the invisible assumptions that shape warfare. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Nazis were sexist, profoundly, systematically sexist. Their entire ideology rested on rigid gender hierarchies. Women, in Nazi thinking, belonged in the home, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. They were seen as politically naive, intellectually inferior, certainly incapable of serious resistance activities. And that massive blind spot? That became their greatest vulnerability. Think about it. If you're a Gestapo officer and you're looking for dangerous spies and saboteurs, what image is in your mind? A man, almost certainly, probably young, physically capable, militarily trained. Your unconscious biases shape what you see. You're scrutinizing every young man who crosses your path. But that woman walking past, the one who smiled politely, your brain barely registers her as a potential threat. She's invisible, a ghost. This wasn't just theoretical. It was documented repeatedly in German security reports and post-war interrogations. Female operatives consistently reported less scrutiny at checkpoints, easier access to restricted areas, and a general assumption from German personnel that women couldn't be dangerous. The SOE recognized this advantage early. Beginning in 1942, they began recruiting women for missions into occupied France, and the results were remarkable. Women could move more freely. They attracted less suspicion. They could adopt cover identities, courier, secretary, shop clerk, that provided perfect justification for being in multiple locations, having contact with many different people, and traveling extensively. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. These women weren't just succeeding because of enemy prejudice. They were often outperforming male operatives in the actual skills of espionage. Why? Because the social training women received in the 1940s society, the constant awareness of others' reactions, the ability to read emotional subtext, the practice of maintaining composure under scrutiny, these weren't just social skills, they were espionage skills. Let me introduce you to some of these remarkable women, starting with perhaps the most extraordinary of them all, Noor Inayat Khan, codename Madeline. Born in Moscow to an Indian Sufi teacher and an American mother. Raised in Paris, a musician, a children's book author, someone described by those who knew her as gentle, sensitive, almost otherworldly in her spirituality. On paper, perhaps the least likely candidate imaginable for covert operations. She was also one of the SOE's most successful radio operators in occupied France, operating under impossible conditions, evading capture far longer than anyone expected, and transmitting intelligence that saved countless Allied lives. How does someone like Noor survive in the most dangerous role in espionage? Radio operators were hunted relentlessly. The Germans had sophisticated radio detection equipment. They could triangulate a transmitter's location in minutes. The average lifespan of a radio operator in occupied France was 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And yet Noor operated for months, constantly on the move, transmitting from different locations, one step ahead of the German detection teams. The answer lies partly in that very unlikeliness. Noor didn't look dangerous. She didn't act suspicious. She mastered the art of being overlooked, of blending into the background so completely that even people searching for her couldn't quite see her. Her gentleness wasn't a weakness, it was her most effective disguise. But Noor's story also reveals the terrible cost of this work. She was eventually betrayed, captured by the Gestapo in October 1943. Despite brutal interrogations, she revealed nothing. She refused to cooperate, attempted escape multiple times, and was eventually transferred to Dachau concentration camp, where she was executed in September 1944. Her last word was reported to be liberté. Odette Sansom, codename Lise. A French woman living in England, a mother of 3 daughters who volunteered for the SOE after seeing a recruitment notice. Her first mission took her back to occupied France as a courier, carrying messages between resistance cells, facilitating coordination between groups that couldn't safely communicate directly. Odette's cover was as the wife of her commanding officer Peter Churchill, no relation to Winston. This cover provided them both with more flexibility and explained why they were frequently together. But it also meant that when they were betrayed and captured in April 1943, Odette faced a unique opportunity for deception. Here's where Odette's story becomes almost mythical in its audacity. During interrogation by the Gestapo, she claimed that Peter Churchill was actually Winston Churchill's nephew and that she was his wife. This was completely false. She wasn't even married to Peter at the time, but it was strategically brilliant. If the Germans believed they'd captured someone connected to Churchill, they might keep her alive for potential prisoner exchange. It worked. Sort of. Odette was still tortured. Her toenails were pulled out. She was branded with a red-hot iron. She was kept in solitary confinement. But she was kept alive, transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp rather than being executed immediately. She survived the war and was eventually awarded the George Cross, Britain's second highest award for gallantry. But let's talk about that torture for a moment, because this is where the gender dimension of ghost operations becomes particularly harrowing. The Nazis weren't just brutal interrogators, they specifically targeted women with sexual violence and gender-based torture. Female operatives faced horrors that their male counterparts didn't, violations designed not just to extract information, but to destroy their sense of self. And yet, statistically, female operatives were no more likely to break under interrogation than male operatives. If anything, some evidence suggests they were more resistant. Why? One theory among resistance historians: women in the 1940s had spent their entire lives navigating patriarchal systems, enduring various forms of violation and control, developing psychological resilience as a survival mechanism. The torture was horrible, unimaginable, but it wasn't unfamiliar in its essential dynamic of male violence against women. This doesn't diminish the courage required, it contextualizes it. These women weren't just brave, they were leveraging hard-won survival skills from their everyday existence as women in a sexist society and applying them to the extreme context of Nazi occupation. Virginia Hall, American, codename Marie, perhaps the most legendary of all Allied female operatives, and certainly one of the most wanted. Virginia had one leg. She'd lost the lower part of her left leg in a hunting accident years before the war and wore a wooden prosthesis she called Cuthbert. The SOE initially rejected her application because of her disability. Imagine that for a moment. You have one leg, you walk with a pronounced limp, you're trying to conduct covert operations in enemy territory where you need to move quickly, potentially run, definitely not draw attention to yourself. On every rational level, this should be impossible, and yet Virginia Hall became one of the most effective operatives in France, organizing resistance networks, coordinating supply drops, conducting sabotage operations, and evading capture despite being one of the Gestapo's most wanted individuals. How? By turning her apparent vulnerability into an advantage. Virginia created cover identities as an elderly rural woman, personas where a limp wasn't suspicious but expected. She used makeup and costume to appear years older. She mastered rural French dialects. She became invisible precisely because people saw her disability and dismissed her as a threat. The Gestapo knew someone was coordinating major resistance activities in Lyon. They had descriptions, they had reports, they were desperately searching, and they kept missing her because they were looking for a dangerous operative, not a limping old farm woman making her way slowly through the countryside. When things got too hot in Lyon, Virginia escaped to Spain, on foot, over the Pyrenees Mountains in winter, with one leg. The journey nearly killed her. She radioed back to London. "Cuthbert is being tiresome." The radio operator, not knowing what Cuthbert was, responded, "If Cuthbert is tiresome, have him eliminated." Virginia replied, "Cuthbert is my wooden leg. Can't be done." There's dark humor in that exchange, but also something profound. Virginia could joke about her prosthetic leg because she'd long since refused to let it define her limitations. In a world that told her she was disabled, therefore incapable, she simply rejected the premise and got on with being extraordinary. She later joined the American OSS, precursor to the CIA, and returned to France to coordinate operations leading up to and after D-Day. She was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman to receive it during World War II, Nancy Wake, who we mentioned earlier. Australian, living in France, married to a wealthy Marseille businessman. Nancy initially worked with the resistance, helping Allied soldiers escape through France to Spain. When the Gestapo began closing in, that 5 million franc bounty on her head, she escaped to Britain and joined the SOE. Nancy was different from Noor's gentleness or Odette's quiet determination. Nancy was bold, aggressive, almost reckless in her courage. She parachuted back into France in 1944, led a network of over 7,000 resistance fighters, and personally participated in combat operations. There's a documented incident where Nancy killed a German sentry with her bare hands to prevent him from raising an alarm. Another where she cycled over 300 miles through German checkpoints to replace destroyed radio codes, completing the journey in under 72 hours. When asked after the war about fear, Nancy reportedly said, "I don't see why we women should wave our men a proud goodbye and then knit them balaclavas." But here's what's remarkable about Nancy's story. She survived. Unlike Noor, unlike so many others, Nancy made it through the war. She fought in the liberation of France, saw victory, and lived until 2011, dying at age 98 in London. She carried the memories of what she'd done, who she'd been, for over 6 decades after the war ended, which raises a haunting question. When you've lived as someone else, killed with your own hands, operated beyond all normal moral boundaries for years, how do you return to ordinary life? Can you? The women of Ghost Operations weren't a monolithic group. They came from different backgrounds, different countries, different motivations. Some were driven by patriotism, others by personal loss, husbands killed, families destroyed. Some were escaping restrictive peacetime lives, finding in war a freedom and purpose they'd never experienced before. And some simply recognized evil and decided they couldn't stand by. What united them was their effectiveness, and increasingly as the war progressed, their recognition by Allied command. Initial skepticism about using women in combat roles evaporated in the face of operational success. By 1943 to 44, women weren't just accepted in Ghost Operations, they were actively sought after, recruited, trained, and deployed at increasing rates. Let's talk about Violette Sabo, codename Louise. British of French descent, widow of a French Foreign Legion officer killed at El Alamein. Violette joined the SOE driven by grief and determination to continue her husband's fight. She conducted 2 missions into France, the first successfully. On her second mission in June 1944, days after D-Day, she was captured after a firefight with German troops. Violette was interrogated at Gestapo headquarters in Paris, then transferred to Ravensbrück. She was executed there in early 1945, just months before the camp's liberation. She was 23 years old. She left behind a young daughter who would grow up knowing her mother only through stories and a posthumous George Cross, 23. Think about what you were doing at 23. Think about what most people that age are dealing with, finishing university, starting careers, maybe having their first serious relationships. Violette was conducting armed resistance operations deep in enemy territory, engaging in firefights with German soldiers and ultimately dying in a concentration camp. The courage required isn't just extraordinary, it's almost incomprehensible. Pearl Witherington, codename Marie, British citizen raised in France, fluent in French, working as a secretary when war broke out. Pearl joined the SOE and was parachuted into France in 1943 as a courier. When her network's leader was arrested, Pearl took command, leading over 1,500 resistance fighters in guerrilla operations across central France. Her network conducted sabotage operations that destroyed railway lines, disrupted German communications, and harassed German units retreating after D-Day. Pearl coordinated her forces so effectively that German commanders believed they were facing Allied paratroopers, not local resistance. After the liberation, she was offered the civilian award of Member of the British Empire. Pearl refused it, stating, "There was nothing civil about what I did." She insisted on and eventually received the military Croix de Guerre from the French government instead. Pearl's refusal of the civilian medal raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember and honor these women. The British establishment wanted to frame their service as auxiliary, support-based, civilian in nature, even though they were conducting armed combat operations, leading military units, killing enemy soldiers. Why the reluctance to acknowledge them as warriors? Because acknowledging women as combat effective challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, warfare, and capability. This pattern repeated across Allied recognition of female operatives. They were decorated, yes, but often with civilian awards or lesser military honors than their male counterparts received for equivalent or lesser service. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Celebrate their courage and effectiveness, but don't acknowledge that they were soldiers in any traditional sense. Yvonne Cormeau, codename Annette. British, widow of a French officer, mother of a young daughter. Yvonne operated as a radio operator in southwest France for over a year. Extraordinarily long survival for such a dangerous role. She transmitted over 400 messages, coordinated supply drops, and survived multiple close calls with German radio detection units. After one near capture, Yvonne had to abandon her radio and go into hiding. Rather than evacuate to Britain, she remained in place, eventually secured new equipment, and resumed operations. Her network helped coordinate the resistance uprising that liberated Toulouse in August 1944. She survived the war and, like Nancy Wake, carried those memories for decades, dying in 1997 at age 88. What strikes you hearing these stories? Maybe it's the courage, maybe it's the tragedy of those who didn't survive. But here's what strikes me: the sheer ordinariness of their pre-war lives. Secretaries, musicians, housewives, mothers, not soldiers, not intelligence professionals, not anyone who should have been capable of what they achieved. And yet they were, which means the capabilities were always there, just never tested, never acknowledged, never unleashed until circumstances demanded it. These women didn't just contribute to ghost operations, they redefined what espionage and resistance could be. They proved that effectiveness in covert warfare wasn't about physical strength or aggressive masculinity. It was about psychological insight, social intelligence, adaptability, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself but persists quietly in the face of unimaginable pressure. And here's the most important question. If women could be this effective in ghost operations, what does that tell us about the artificial limitations placed on women in military service more broadly? If a woman with one leg could coordinate major resistance networks, if musicians could become skilled radio operators under fire, if mothers could lead guerrilla warfare, what justification remained for excluding women from combat roles, from intelligence services, from positions of command? The answer, of course, is that no justification remained. The ghost operations proved it. But that recognition came slowly, painfully, with resistance from military establishments that didn't want to confront their own prejudices. Even today, some military historians downplay the role of female operatives, treating them as interesting footnotes rather than central actors in the intelligence war. But the operational records don't lie. Female agents had comparable or superior success rates to their male counterparts. They survived longer in deep cover. They were betrayed less frequently, possibly because their social networks were more reliable, possibly because they were better judges of character, possibly because they navigated complex social dynamics more skillfully. After the war, many of these women struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD, though it wasn't diagnosed or treated as such at the time. They'd been trained to never speak about their work. Operational security was drilled into them so deeply that even after the war ended, many remained silent for decades. Their families often didn't know what they'd done. Their communities saw them as ordinary women who'd had some vague war service. Imagine carrying those experiences alone. The memories of people you'd killed, people you'd seen killed, people you'd betrayed or sacrificed for the mission. The psychological compartmentalization required to live a double life for years, now no longer necessary, but impossible to simply switch off. The skills that kept you alive in occupied France, constant vigilance, trust no one, always have an escape route. These don't make for peaceful civilian existence. Some adapted better than others. Nancy Wake became something of a public figure in her later years, giving interviews, writing memoirs, speaking openly about her experiences. Others, like Yvonne Cormeau, remained largely private, sharing their stories only in limited contexts. And Some, like Noor Inayat Khan, never got the chance to tell their own stories at all. We know them through official records, through the accounts of others, through the gaps and silences in the historical record. Here's what haunts me about the women of ghost operations. We celebrate their courage, their success, their impact on the war. But do we truly comprehend the price they paid? Not just those who died. Their sacrifice is obvious, honored, memorialized, but those who survived, who lived for decades with fractured identities, with memories of violence and deception, with the knowledge that they'd done things, necessary things maybe, but things that changed them forever. The feminist reading of ghost operations is complicated. On one hand, yes, these women shattered gender barriers, proved female capability in the most extreme circumstances, and paved the way for greater female participation in military and intelligence services. That's undeniably important and should be celebrated. On the other hand, they succeeded partly by exploiting enemy sexism, by using their perceived harmlessness as camouflage, by operating within a system that simultaneously celebrated their contributions and refused to fully acknowledge their equality. They were exceptional, yes, but exceptionalism can reinforce, rather than challenge, systemic inequality. Look at these extraordinary women who succeeded despite being women isn't quite the same as women are equally capable and should have equal opportunity. And there's this uncomfortable truth. Some of these women internalized the very prejudices they were exploiting. Post-war interviews reveal that several female operatives expressed surprise at their own capabilities, described themselves as not naturally brave, or insisted they were only doing what anyone would do, while male operatives typically had no such hesitation in claiming their own heroism. The patriarchal conditioning ran deep, even in women who had objectively proven themselves as combat effective as any soldier. But let's be clear, whatever the complicated politics of their recognition, whatever the psychological costs, whatever the limitations of how their stories have been remembered, the women of ghost operations were heroes in the fullest sense. They volunteered for missions that terrified experienced male soldiers. They operated under conditions that would break most people. They saved lives, disrupted enemy operations, and contributed materially to Allied victory. And they did it while being consistently underestimated, underpaid, and under-recognized, which in some ways makes their achievements even more remarkable. So what happened when the war ended? What became of the ghosts when they were no longer needed? And what lasting impact did ghost operations have on espionage, on warfare, on our understanding of courage and sacrifice? The immediate post-war period was chaotic, especially for operatives still in the field. The liberation of France in 1944 didn't mean instant safety. Collaborators were being rounded up, sometimes through legitimate justice processes, sometimes through mob violence. In that atmosphere, anyone with questionable papers or unclear background could be suspect. Some operatives had to maintain their cover identities even after the Germans had left because their false papers were safer than trying to prove their real identities without documentation. Imagine that. You've spent years pretending to be someone else, enduring unimaginable stress to maintain your cover, dreaming of the day you could reclaim your real identity. And then liberation comes, and you realize you still can't admit who you really are because no one would believe you, and your own side's records are classified so deeply that you have no way to prove your service. You're trapped in the lie even after the reason for the lie has ended. This happened to multiple operatives. Some spent months or even years in bureaucratic limbo, trying to convince Allied authorities of their actual identities and service records. The very secrecy that protected them during operations now isolated them afterward. For those who did successfully return to Britain or America, reintegration was profoundly difficult. The SOE was dissolved almost immediately after the war, deemed too irregular, too outside normal military structure, potentially embarrassing to peacetime diplomacy. Operatives were given cursory debriefings, sworn to secrecy, and essentially told to go home and resume their lives as if nothing had happened. As if nothing had happened. As if you could just switch off years of living as someone else, of constant danger, of moral compromises that would haunt you forever. As if you could forget the faces of people you killed, people who died because of your intelligence, people you betrayed for the mission. As if you could just slot back into suburban domesticity or office work after coordinating guerrilla warfare. The psychological support was virtually non-existent. PTSD wasn't well understood or recognized. The culture of the time emphasized stiff upper lip and moving forward. Many operatives internalized their trauma, never speaking about their experiences, suffering in silence. Marriages fell apart, careers stalled. Some struggled with alcoholism, depression, or other mental health issues that went untreated because seeking help meant trying to explain experiences you were legally forbidden to discuss. Despite the difficult personal aftermath, ghost operations fundamentally changed modern espionage. The techniques developed by the SOE, identity construction, psychological warfare, perception management, asymmetric operations, became foundational to Cold War intelligence services. The CIA, established in 1947, explicitly studied SOE operations and incorporated many of their methods. The same with Soviet intelligence services, which had conducted their own similar operations during the war and were equally interested in what the British had accomplished. The entire architecture of Cold War espionage, deep cover operatives, false identities, psychological operations, had its roots in the ghost operations of World War II. Here's the continuity. During the war, operatives disappeared into occupied Europe, becoming different people to fight the Nazis. During the Cold War, operatives disappeared into Soviet society, into Eastern Europe, into any theater where intelligence was needed and conventional military operations weren't possible. The techniques evolved, the technology improved, but the core concept remained. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but a person who can convincingly be someone they're not. Modern identity construction for intelligence operatives is far more sophisticated than what was available in the 1940s. Digital backgrounds, electronic documentation, cyber footprints, all have to be fabricated now. But the psychological principles remain unchanged. You still have to internalize your cover identity so completely that you can maintain it under pressure. You still have to understand the cultural context you're operating in. You still have to manage the cognitive dissonance of living a lie. Psychological warfare, too, has evolved, but not fundamentally changed. During World War II, ghost operations spread rumors through whisper campaigns and planted documents. Today, the tools are different. Social media, digital manipulation, coordinated disinformation campaigns, but the goal is identical. Subvert enemy perception of reality, create doubt and confusion, amplify existing divisions, make the enemy question what they think they know. In fact, you could argue we're living through an era of ghost operations right now, not in the military sense, but in the information space. How many social media accounts are exactly who they claim to be? How many grassroots movements are actually coordinated operations designed to manipulate public opinion? How many of the conflicts playing out online involve some form of identity deception, perception management, or psychological manipulation? The techniques pioneered in occupied Europe have metastasized into something far broader, far more pervasive, and far harder to defend against. At least in World War II, there was a clear enemy, clear objectives, clear moral justification. In the modern information environment, the lines are far more blurred. But let's return to the specific legacy of World War II ghost operations. Beyond the technical and tactical innovations, what did they teach us about courage, about human capability, about the nature of warfare itself? First lesson: never underestimate anyone based on demographic categories. The generals who initially resisted using women in combat roles, who doubted whether civilians could be effective operatives, who assumed you needed traditional military training to conduct successful operations, they were all proven catastrophically wrong. Some of the most effective warriors of World War II were people nobody expected, doing things nobody thought possible. This lesson has been learned and forgotten repeatedly throughout history. Every generation seems to need to relearn that human capability isn't limited to the demographics that hold institutional power. Ghost operations provided clear, documented proof, And yet discrimination persists, underestimation continues, and we're still having arguments about who should be allowed to serve, in what capacities. Second lesson, psychology is as important as firepower. Maybe more important. The ghost operations achieved strategic effects completely disproportionate to their size or resources through psychological manipulation, perception management, and exploiting enemy assumptions. They didn't outgun the Nazis, they outthought them. Modern military doctrine has internalized this to some degree. Every major military now has psychological operations units, information warfare capabilities, and recognition that the cognitive dimension of conflict is crucial. But there's still institutional bias toward kinetic operations, toward measurable physical destruction, toward the visible and quantifiable. Here's why that's a problem. The conflicts of the 21st century are increasingly informational and psychological. Traditional military superiority matters less when your adversary is manipulating your population's perception of reality, eroding trust in institutions, amplifying divisions, and conducting warfare in the cognitive space. The lessons of ghost operations are more relevant now than ever, yet we're still structurally biased toward the wrong kind of response. Third lesson, the cost of victory includes psychological casualties that aren't visible on the battlefield. The operatives who conducted ghost operations paid a price that never appeared in casualty statistics, that wasn't acknowledged with Purple Hearts, or disability benefits that often went completely unrecognized because the suffering was internal, invisible, and stigmatized. We're better at recognizing PTSD now than we were in the 1940s. We have more resources, more understanding, less stigma, but we still struggle to fully account for the psychological cost of asking people to do things that damage their mental health, their sense of self, their moral clarity. We celebrate the mission's success while minimizing the human cost. Fourth lesson, innovation often comes from the margins, from people operating outside established institutional structures, from those who aren't constrained by conventional thinking precisely because they were never fully included in the conventional system. The SOE was itself marginal, viewed with suspicion by regular military command, operating outside normal chains of authority, doing things that made traditional officers uncomfortable. And within the SOE, the most innovative and effective operations often came from the most unlikely operatives: women, civilians, people with disabilities, anyone who brought a different perspective precisely because they'd been excluded from traditional military service. This has profound implications for how we structure our institutions, how we recruit talent, how we think about expertise and capability. The people who saved Europe weren't the ones you'd pick from a conventional military roster. They were the ones who could think differently, who brought skills and perspectives that weren't valued by traditional hierarchies, who succeeded precisely because they didn't fit the expected template. Fifth lesson, and perhaps most important, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it and when they're given the opportunity. Every single operative in ghost operations was, at some point, an ordinary person living an ordinary life. They weren't superheroes. They weren't born special. They were people who, when confronted with the choice between comfortable passivity and dangerous resistance, chose resistance. This is both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring because it suggests that heroism isn't rare, isn't genetic, isn't limited to a special class of people. It's latent in many of us, waiting for circumstances that demand it. But unsettling because it raises uncomfortable questions. If ordinary people could be that brave, that capable, that willing to sacrifice, what's our excuse? When we're confronted with injustice, with evil, with systems that need to be resisted, why aren't we stepping up? Now, before we succumb to romanticizing ghost operations, we need to acknowledge the moral complexity. These operatives did things that in any other context would be called crimes. They lied extensively and elaborately. They manipulated people who trusted them. They sometimes condemned innocent people to suspicion or death as collateral damage. They killed, not always in direct combat, sometimes through deception that led others to their deaths. The moral justification rests entirely on the context. They were fighting Nazi Germany, one of history's clearest examples of systematic evil. The moral calculus seems straightforward. Anything was justified to defeat that regime, to save the people being murdered in concentration camps, to end the war faster and save lives overall. But what happens when the moral context is less clear? What happens when the same techniques, identity deception, psychological manipulation, targeted killing, compromising innocent people as collateral damage, are employed in conflicts where good and evil aren't so obviously delineated? This is the dangerous legacy of ghost operations. The techniques worked, they're effective, and effectiveness is seductive, especially to intelligence services operating in moral grey zones. The operatives themselves struggled with this. Post-war accounts revealed deep moral wrestling with what they'd done. Some found peace by contextualizing their actions within the larger fight against Nazism. Others carried guilt and doubt for the rest of their lives. A few rejected their former work entirely, speaking out against the intelligence services they'd once served, arguing that the ends didn't justify the means. There's no easy answer here. War creates impossible moral dilemmas. Ghost operations were effective, probably necessary, and certainly contributed to Allied victory, but they also normalized techniques of deception and manipulation that have since been employed in far more morally ambiguous contexts. Hook. Consider this. The operative who learns to lie so convincingly that she can maintain false identity under torture. What happens to her relationship with truth afterward? The operative who learns to manipulate others' perceptions to exploit their biases and fears, does that skill just disappear when the war ends? Or does it become part of who they are, how they navigate all relationships going forward? The psychological literature on this is limited, partly because so many operatives never spoke about their experiences, partly because the institutional focus was on operational effectiveness rather than psychological aftermath. But what evidence exists suggests that living a lie, even in service of a just cause, damages the liar. Trust becomes difficult. Authentic relationships become challenging. The boundaries between performance and reality remain blurred. Let's talk about remembrance. How should we remember ghost operations? How do we honor these people appropriately? The immediate post-war period saw some recognition, medals, commendations, official acknowledgement of sacrifice, but much remained classified for decades. The full scope of SOE operations wasn't publicly known until files began being declassified in the 1990s. Some operational details remain classified to this day, protecting intelligence methods still in use or protecting people who might face retaliation. This creates a strange situation where some of the war's most significant heroes remained unknown for generations. Children grew up not knowing what their parents had done. Communities never knew that the quiet person living next door had parachuted into occupied France and coordinated resistance networks. The recognition came late, incomplete, and for many, posthumously. There's a particular tragedy in this. The people who most deserved to be celebrated for their courage were precisely the people whose service had to remain secret. They saved lives, changed history, displayed extraordinary bravery, and then had to watch as others received parades and recognition while they remained silent. How do you process that? How do you not become bitter? Memorialization has improved. There are now museums, monuments, books, films. The SOE agents have been honored by multiple governments. Educational curricula include their stories. Public awareness has grown significantly. But I'd argue we still don't fully comprehend what they did, who they were, what it cost them. We've turned some of them into legends, which is fine. They deserve legendary status. But legends can be distancing. They can make the people seem somehow different from us, special in ways that we're not, capable of things we couldn't do. The truth is more uncomfortable. They were just people. People who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. People who were terrified but acted anyway. People who were damaged by what they did but believed it was necessary. People exactly like us who rose to meet a moment of historical crisis. Which brings us back to that question. What would we do? It's easy to imagine ourselves as heroes when we're sitting comfortably, reading history, judging the past. It's much harder when the actual choice presents itself. When the knock comes at the door, when you have to decide between safety and resistance, when you have to calculate whether you're willing to risk not just your life, but your family's lives for a cause. Most people throughout history choose safety. That's not cowardice, it's survival instinct, it's rational self-interest, it's human nature. The operatives who joined ghost operations were exceptions, rare exceptions, and that rarity is what makes their courage so remarkable. The modern world faces different threats than 1940s Europe, but threats nonetheless. Authoritarianism is rising in multiple countries. Democracy is under pressure. Information warfare is pervasive. Climate change threatens civilization itself. We have our own crises, our own choices between comfortable passivity and risky resistance. So here's the uncomfortable question the ghost operations force us to confront. Are we stepping up? When we see injustice, do we resist or rationalize? When we see systems that need changing, do we act or accommodate? When we're called to sacrifice for something larger than ourselves, do we answer or ignore the call? The operatives of World War II didn't have the luxury of ignoring the call. The crisis was too immediate, too existential. But that doesn't mean their example is irrelevant to our less dramatic but still significant challenges. They showed what's possible when ordinary people decide that some things are worth risking everything for. Let's return, in closing, to some specific names, specific people, specific lives, because ultimately, ghost operations wasn't an abstract concept or a strategic innovation. It was human beings with all their flaws and fears and extraordinary courage. Noor Inayat Khan, the musician who became a legendary radio operator, who maintained her cover under impossible pressure, who refused to break under torture, who died with liberté on her lips. Her sacrifice wasn't just tactical, it was deeply personal, deeply spiritual. She believed in non-violence as a philosophical principle, yet engaged in warfare because she believed Nazi evil had to be opposed. That internal contradiction, that moral complexity, that's the reality of resistance. Odette Sansom, who endured torture, who protected others through her deception, who survived concentration camps and lived to tell her story. Her post-war life was quiet, deliberately ordinary, a conscious choice to reclaim normalcy after years of extraordinary danger. That choice matters too. Not everyone needs to remain exceptional forever. Sometimes courage is putting down the burden and trying to heal. Virginia Hall, who refused to let disability define her limitations, who turned every obstacle into an advantage, who coordinated major resistance operations while literally climbing mountains with one leg. Her story demolishes any excuse based on physical limitation. If she could do what she did, what's stopping the rest of us from attempting difficult things? Nancy Wake, who was bold when boldness was needed, aggressive when aggression served the mission, and unrepentant about violence when violence saved lives. Her post-war struggles with PTSD, with relationships, with finding meaning in peacetime, those struggles matter as much as her wartime heroics. They're part of the complete story. And the ones whose names we don't know. The operatives whose files remain classified. The ones who died without recognition. The ones who survived but never spoke about what they did. The ones whose contributions were minimized or erased. They're part of this story too, their invisible presence a reminder that much of history happens in shadows, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but no less real. Ghost operations changed the course of World War II. The intelligence they gathered informed Allied strategy. The sabotage they coordinated disrupted German operations. The psychological warfare they conducted demoralized enemy forces and diverted resources from critical battlefields. Historians disagree about exact numbers, but estimates suggest that SOE operations may have shortened the war by months, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. But beyond the strategic impact, ghost operations revealed something fundamental about human nature, about courage, about the capacity for transformation. They proved that identity is more fluid than we think, that people can become radically different versions of themselves when necessary, that the boundaries between who we are and who we could be are more permeable than we imagine. This has positive and negative implications. Positive. We're more capable than we think, more adaptable, more resilient. When circumstances demand it, we can rise to meet them. Negative. If we can become heroes, we can also become monsters. The same psychological flexibility that allowed operatives to become effective resistance fighters could, in different circumstances, allow ordinary people to become perpetrators of atrocity. The difference is choice, moral choice, the decision about what kind of person to become, what cause to serve, what values to uphold. The ghost operations operatives made choices we can admire. They chose to resist evil, to risk everything for something larger than themselves, to become whatever was necessary to fight fascism. But they also showed us that such choices have costs, real, psychological costs, costs that couldn't be fully anticipated when they volunteered, costs they carried for the rest of their lives, costs that sometimes included never fully recovering their original identities, never fully escaping the person they became during the war. So how should we remember them? With gratitude, certainly. With respect for their courage and their sacrifice. With honesty about the costs they paid and the moral complexity of their work. With recognition that they were human beings, not legends, people who were frightened and flawed and extraordinary all at once, but also with commitment to the values they fought for, freedom, justice, resistance to tyranny, commitment to learning the lessons their experiences teach us about courage, about capability, about the psychology of deception and the price of secrecy. Commitment to ensuring that their stories aren't forgotten, sanitized, or reduced to simple narratives of heroism that ignore the complexity. The invisible war they fought was won. The Nazis were defeated. Europe was liberated. The immediate crisis passed. But the larger questions their service raised remain unanswered. What are we willing to sacrifice for our values? How do we balance moral purity with tactical effectiveness? What do we owe to those who fight invisible wars on our behalf? How do we support them afterward? How do we honor their service without romanticizing the trauma it inflicted? These aren't historical questions, they're present tense questions, because somewhere right now, someone is making the choice to resist rather than comply, to risk rather than accommodate, to become someone else in service of something larger. The ghosts still walk among us, still operate in shadows, still pay invisible costs for visible freedom. The legacy of World War II's ghost operations isn't just tactical or historical, it's moral and psychological. It's about the extraordinary things ordinary people can do when they must. It's about the price of that extraordinary effort. It's about courage that doesn't announce itself, sacrifice that remains invisible, trauma that's never fully resolved. It's about people who disappeared into lies so complete that part of them never fully returned, who became ghosts not just to their enemies, but in some ways to themselves, who saved the world by losing themselves. And the question they leave us with isn't whether we're capable of similar courage. Their example proves that we are. The question is whether we'll choose it. Whether, when our moment comes, when the crisis of our generation demands response, we'll have the courage to become whatever we need to be, to disappear into purpose, to sacrifice in ways that might never be recognized, to fight battles that might never be acknowledged. The ghosts of ghost operations can't answer that question for us. They can only show us that it's possible, that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can become heroes. Not perfect heroes, flawed, traumatized, morally complicated heroes, but heroes nonetheless. Their war is over. Ours continues. Different enemies, different tactics, different battlefields, but the same fundamental choice. Comfort or courage? Safety or sacrifice? Passivity or resistance? They chose. What will we choose? The invisible front awaits. The question is whether we're ready to become ghosts ourselves, to disappear into purpose, to fight in shadows for a future we might never see. This is their legacy. This is their challenge. This is their gift to us. The knowledge that it can be done, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, that courage exists even in the most unlikely people, even in the darkest times. Remember them, honor them, Learn from them. And when your moment comes, and it will come, remember that you carry within you the same capacity for courage that they discovered within themselves. The ghosts are watching, waiting to see if we learn the lessons they died teaching us. Will we measure up to their example? Will we have their courage? Only time will tell, but their stories remain testament to what's possible when ordinary people refuse to be ordinary anymore.